keeping yourself safe and also sane at the same time. And I also hope that you had a good break, a good mid-semester break last week. Uh, so now we are back to our normal routine, in which, as usual, I will deliver a live lecture every week, and then we will also have a virtual meeting once a week to discuss, the contents of what I have delivered in this live lecture. So inshallah, in the next 40 to 45 minutes or so, I will present on the topic of interpretation and intellectual traditions, when it comes to the Quran. So basically, we are going to look at various issues or various dimensions and aspects when it comes to tafsir or Quranic exegesis. In particular, for today, inshallah, we will look at the history of Quranic exegesis. So we will trace back the history of tafsir, and also we will look at modern trends in Quranic exegesis. So we will look at history, uh, what transpired in the past, in relation to Quranic exegesis, and then we will look at some modern trends in Quranic exegesis. So these are the two subtopics which I shall cover in the next 40 to 45 minutes or so, inshallah. So just let me enlarge the slides. So when we talk about tafsir, it actually began when the Quran was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So simultaneously, tafsir or Quranic exegesis started with the revelation of the Quran, because the Quran was revealed, or the revelation of the Quran, the revelation of the verses or passages of the Quran brought new ideas, and also terms, and also adapted a range of pre-Islamic concepts. So this we must understand, that the Quran brought together with it new concepts, and at the same time also adapted, or adopted a range of pre-Islamic concepts which were not in contradiction with Islam. And some interpretation was needed to clarify the Quran's teachings. And we have seen, in fact, that even the companions of the Prophet ﷺ sometimes had some difficulties in understanding certain verses of the Quran, and they would then refer to the Prophet ﷺ, to seek clarification and to basically unravel any confusion that they might have when it comes to certain verses of the Quran. And the Prophet ﷺ, who the Quran was revealed to, was the first to undertake this task of interpreting Quranic verses. And it is indeed um, one of the responsibilities of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yani Allah mentions clearly in the Quran that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's role was to clarify, or to explain the Quran to the people. So in this verse in Surah An-Nahl, it is clear, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ وَلَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. We send them with clear signs and scriptures. We have sent down the message to you, to yani Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so that you can explain to people what was sent for them. So here, this task of explaining the Quran to the people, or to the public, or to the audience at that time, was a task which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explicitly mentions in the Quran. So part of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's mission was to assist in explaining the meanings of the Quran. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did this in both words and actions, but mainly through his actions, So only verbally interpreted particular parts of the Quran. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would provide interpretation or clarification, verbally when it comes to certain Quranic verses, which perhaps required clarification in that sense. Um, but as mentioned here, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam manifested, the teachings, principles which are advocated by the Quran in practice, in his actions. An in-depth explanation of the entire text or the Quran would not have been necessary, since the companions were Arabic speaking and were generally familiar with the broader context and the meanings of the Quran. Yeah, so there was in fact uh, uh, or perhaps we could say that due to the companions' understanding of the Arabic language and also the context in which the verses of the Quran were revealed, there was there wasn't a necessity at that time, yeah, for the explanation of the whole Quran, each and every verse of the Quran. Yeah, so there was no necessity as such at that time, because the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam basically understood the Quran because it was revealed in Arabic, and they also understood the context in which the Quran was revealed. And most of the Prophet Wasallam's interpretation existed in the form of practical exegesis, meaning that he manifested the principles, the teachings of the Quran in his actions. And again, I always quote this hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, in which when she was asked to describe the character of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, uh, her answer was simple, or her response was simple, in which she said, "Kana khuluquhul Quran," that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's character, ethics, manners, yeah, basically was the Quran, meaning the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam internalized the teachings of the Quran, and his actions embodies the teachings of the Quran. After the death of the Prophet ﷺ, only a small number of his immediate companions are reported to have contributed to the area of Quranic exegesis. So there were a few companions, yeah, who were known to be a Quranic exegetes, yeah, Abdullah ibn Abbas, for example, yeah. So companions who were engaged in exegesis drew on several sources for understanding and interpreting the Quran. So these are the sources which the companions relied on in providing Quranic exegesis. Yeah. So the Quran itself, yeah, because there are certain verses which would explain other verses, yeah, and also and praxis information received from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning that the hadith, which perhaps comes in the form of the speech of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam or the action of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yeah, that would also be relied on in interpreting the Quran. Thirdly, their own understanding of the language of the text, yeah, because the Quran was revealed in Arabic, and they were also masters of the Arabic language, yeah. So they would also rely on their understanding of the language of the text. And to a certain extent, yeah, they also relied on traditions of people of the book, yeah, of Ahlul Kitab, yeah, particularly in relation to narratives in the Quran about past prophets, peoples, and events. Yeah, so when it comes to the Quran's narratives, yeah, of the people of the past, yeah, which we basically share with the people of the book, because these events and narratives also appear in the traditions of the people of the book. So here we are particularly mentioning the Christians and the Jews, yeah. So that is why, to a certain extent, some Quranic exegetes also relied on the traditions of the people of the book, sometimes termed as Israeliyat, yeah, in explaining such events which are mentioned in the Quran, yeah. The exegesis of the companions remained largely oral, yeah, rather than being written down, yeah, and it was transmitted to their students. So here the opinions of the companions when it comes to Quranic verses were transmitted, or mainly or primarily transmitted orally, yeah. And as we have mentioned, when it comes to the Quran as well, yeah, and even hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, during that period, it was mainly an oral tradition. So it is then not a surprise, yeah, for even their views or opinions when it comes to certain verses of the Quran or Quranic exegesis are also transmitted orally. So now we move on to the period of the successors, yeah, and we have to acknowledge that they were much more heterogeneous than the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and as such, there was a need for interpretation of the Quran. So the need here increased, yeah, the need for the interpretation of the Quran increased because the society at that time was more heterogeneous. So with the liberation of various lands, yeah, and also uh, the interaction with other cultures, with other societies, with other civilizations, yeah, and also the fact that non-Arabs also began to embrace Islam. So there was a need, yeah, for Quranic exegesis. So exegesis, though still informal, began to develop on a larger scale, and key centers of learning were in Mecca, Medina, Damascus, Yemen, and also Iraq. And the successors would look to the Quran and its interpretation in search of guidance in the face of new social context, because they faced new challenges. Yeah, a new social context emerged, so they would have to infer from the Quran, yeah, lessons, principles to deal with such changing contexts or times. So the interaction with different cultural, political, and legal practices, yeah, as I mentioned previously, and also greater interaction between Islam and other religious traditions. So these basically provided the impetus for a more active engagement with the Quran, and also inferring principles, yeah, lessons from the Quran to deal with such challenges. Interpretation and understanding of the Quran became increasingly diverse, yeah, during the time of the successors. Why? Because it was also during this time that divisions occurred among Muslims, yeah, along religious, political, and theological lines. Yeah, remember after the death of Uthman, then the issue between Ali and Muawiyah. Yeah, uh, and this basically uh, caused, yeah, a division among the Muslims along initially political lines, but then it developed uh, into a theological theological disagreements as well also emerged as such. Yeah, so it is then not surprising to find diverse interpretations and understanding of Quranic verses, because perhaps each group, yeah, would view certain verses differently, yeah, and they would interpret certain verses to the advantage of the group. So a rudimentary form of the discipline of Quranic exegesis began to emerge during the period of the successors. And most of the earliest forms of Quranic exegesis were transmitted orally, yeah, similar to the period of the companions. Now let's move on to early written exegesis. So it emerged by at least the early part of the second Hijri century. Yeah. Having said that, it did not consist of complete commentaries of the Quran, but perhaps commentaries or explanation of certain parts or certain portions or certain verses of the Quran. Yeah. Having said that, it represented the beginnings of a process of documentation of Quranic exegesis. As for the documentation of the Quran, we have looked at that, yeah, the compilation of the Quran and the standardization of the Quran, which basically happened during the period of the companions, yeah. However, when it comes to the documentation in relation to Quranic exegesis, it emerged in the early part of the second Hijri century. So initially, these works comprised of brief explanatory comments regarding unclear, difficult, or ambiguous words and phrases, yeah, in the Quran. So um, basically, explanation was given about the gharaib, yeah, ambiguous words, and also phrases in the Quran, yeah, and also that which was unclear, and words which were unclear and also ambiguous. Um, Also, it discussed legal and ritual matters and dealt with certain commandments and prohibitions found in the Quran. Yeah. So this is in dealing with ahkam, in dealing with halal and haram. Yeah. So an exegesis of such verses were also, uh, I mean, it was started to be written down during this period. Where the Quran only provided a general instruction, These early exegetical writings attempted to provide explanation and fill in the gaps based on the example of the Prophet ﷺ and the practice of earliest Muslims. Yeah. So um, when verses of the Quran were basically general in nature, yeah, and there was a need to further explain how certain commandments or certain rules are to be implemented or to be manifested in practice, then they would refer to hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So here are examples of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and also the practice of Muslims in the past. By the end of the second Hijri century, exegetical works dealing with the entire Quran were beginning to emerge. Yeah, so in the initial stages, only certain verses were explained. Yeah, however, uh, the tafsir of the Quran as a whole, yeah, and all passages of the Quran as a whole began to emerge in the late second century uh, uh, Hijri. By the early third Hijri century, Quranic exegesis was a fully established discipline. Yeah, so it was by the third century of Hijrah that tafsir uh, emerged as a discipline on its own, a full-fledged discipline on its own. So now let's look at the trends of tafsir in the first 3 centuries. Yeah, because we did mention that it was in the early third century Hijri that the discipline or the field of knowledge or branch of knowledge of tafsir emerged as a discipline on its own, and we also trace back the developments of the science of tafsir, yeah, since the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the body of exegetical works became increasingly large and varied and came to include theological, legal, yeah, religion, political, and also mystical works. As for religio-political exegesis, so now we have to, trace back the conflict between Ali and Muawiyah, which was initially a political crisis, yeah, which also led to, which also had this theological nuance to it, yeah. Um, so we have the Sunni exegesis, which emphasized on a literal rather than allegorical reading of the Quran, which is supported by linguistic evidence wherever possible, and the reliance on hadith, yeah, and also exegetical traditions from the earliest Muslims, yeah, rather than adopt a reason-based approach to interpretation. So there is this reliance on tradition, yeah, in the form of hadith and also opinions of the companions and successors when it comes to Quranic verses and passages. And also the Sunni reject esoteric or hidden meanings of the Quran as they are considered to represent unjustifiable speculation. Yeah. The Shia, on the other hand, tended to adopt a reason-based approach, yeah, and they generally attempted to find explicit references in the Quran to themes which were important to them, yeah, such as imamah, yeah, and also other specifically Shia doctrines. So that was their main, what do you call it? Their their main focus was to basically find in the Quran justifications for their doctrines. The Khariji or the Khawarij, on the other hand, had this puritanical approach, yeah, to Quranic exegesis, where they were uncompromising about the application of the Quran's commandments. It was basically one or zero, yeah, in that sense, meaning that if the Quran says you have to do this, you have to do this, yeah, whatever it is. It is based primarily on a literal reading of the text and does not often consider any deeper meaning. So the a superficial reading of the text perhaps would describe, yeah, this approach to tafsir of Quranic verses by the Khawarij. And then we have theological exegesis, yeah. As we know that initially that which was political then evolved to become a theological conflict, yeah. And scholars of theological exegesis were often associated with one of the two major theological schools of early Islam, either the Mu'tazila or the Ash'ariyah. So either one of these schools, yeah. So when it comes to the theology uh, of the Mufassir, they would often fall into one of these categories, either being uh, recognized as a Mu'tazila or an Ash'ari. So when it comes to the Mu'tazila, they have an uncompromising interpretation of Tawheed, yeah, a consequent belief that the Quran is created as it could not possibly be co-eternal with God, yeah. They said the Quran could is a makhluk, yeah. While we would normally argue that it is kalamullah, that it is the words of God. So basically, here there is this theological difference when it comes to how the Quran itself is being viewed. They relied heavily on linguistic and literary analysis of text, yeah, rationalist interpretations and metaphorical nature of Quranic language, particularly when it speaks about God. So when it comes to the verses regarding the attributes, yeah, of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, they would normally interpret it metaphorically, yeah, and they also had this tendency to use philosophical arguments, yeah, in defense of their theological positions, and rejected any hadith that conflicted with their theological positions. The Ash'ari, on the other hand, strongly questioned the original Mu'tazili understanding of God's essence and attributes, yeah, and they attacked the Mu'tazila's beliefs regarding free will, the nature of divine law, the definition of evil, and also the role of reason when it comes to understanding tradition or understanding scripture, yeah, yani the Quran and also hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Uh, I will not provide examples or details here. This will emerge inshallah later. But this is just to provide an overview, yeah, of theological exegesis and also other forms of early Quranic exegesis. And then we have legal exegesis because as we know, the Quran contains many commandments, yeah, many teachings, yeah, which is to be put into practice. Yeah. So after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, there was a pressing need to understand the rulings, commandments, prohibitions, yeah, and instructions of the Quran as they related to a Muslim's daily life. Yeah. So why it was important? Because it was related to our, or it has an implication on our daily lives. So legal exegesis was in fact among the first forms of exegesis to emerge. Yeah. So the approaches to legal exegesis varied considerably, and disagreements often rose about the intended meaning of concepts that were addressed in two or more seemingly contradictory verses of the Quran. Yeah. So there would be differences of opinion on how to, on how to interpret such verses. And with the emergence of Islamic schools of jurisprudence, yeah, or madhabs, jurists from each of these schools produced a large number of works on legal exegesis, and they focused on what appeared to be legal texts of the Quran, yeah, ayat al-ahkam basically, and provided exegesis in the form of legal opinions. So their focus here was on ayat al-ahkam, on legal text of the Quran, yeah, and their focus was to provide explanation or exegesis in the form of legal opinions in relation to those verses. And then we have mystical exegesis, yeah, which is based on the ideas that developed among Muslim mystics or often termed as Sufis, yeah. And this was in response or in reaction to the wider Muslim community's increasing emphasis on material aspects of life and the growing number of political and factional struggles. So in response to this mystical exegesis that emerged, yeah. So basically, there was more of emphasis on the spiritual aspects of Islam and an exploration of and it attempted to explore, yeah, questions regarding knowledge of God or the nature of human existence and its relation to the divine, yeah, and also mystical allusions in the Quranic text were related most closely to the human spiritual condition and were impossible to understand through superficial readings or arguments over points of law and theology. Yeah, so the emphasis here was about the soul, and also the perhaps the underlying meaning, yeah, of certain verses which would have an impact on one's soul or spirit. Yeah, so spiritual and inner meanings of the Quran were considered to be paramount under this genre of tafsir, of Quranic exegesis. Then we also have philosophical exegesis, yeah, because Muslims began to develop an interest in Greek philosophy, yeah, in the early centuries of Islam. And then there was also this argument whether, this is acceptable or not, yeah, and the place of philosophy in Islam. So many Muslims actually argued against the use of philosophy in exegesis, yeah. Those of a more rationalist orientation wholeheartedly adopted philosophy as a valuable part of the exegetical process. So there were those, yeah, I mean, the majority perhaps, yeah, were against the use of philosophy, while there were those who advocated the use of philosophy when it comes to tafsir of Quranic verses. As for the allegorical interpretation of the Quran, uh, I mean, under this genre of tafsir, yeah, there was this attempt to harmonize, yeah, philosophical ideas with those of the Quran, yeah, and this uh, was perhaps, yeah, done quite easily, yeah, in the sense that, an allegorical interpretation, harmonizing allegorical interpretation and also philosophical ideas was considered to be easy in that sense. Extension of the significance of an expression form real to uh, f- uh, extension of the significance of an expression from real to metaphorical significance, yeah, as with the exercise in philosophy. Now let's look at the modern trends in Quranic exegesis. So we have looked at the past, yeah, in the first 3 centuries of Hijrah, the various trends when it comes to Quranic exegesis. Now let's look at the modern trends in Quranic exegesis. So new forms of exegetical thinking such as modernist, scientific, socio-political, feminist, thematic, and contextual exegesis began to emerge in the modern period. And this was in response to global developments in areas as diverse as politics, the environment, and also ethics. And this was done in the pursuit, yeah, for a balance between traditional, sorry, and modern views of life, yeah, because perhaps um, how the generations, yeah, in the past viewed certain concepts, viewed certain issues were perhaps different, and also the challenges that they face in the past and in the modern period were perhaps also different in nature, and this perhaps required a different set of response. The Bondinist exegesis basically was an active response by Muslims to the challenges posed by modernity, while remaining faithful to the teachings of their religion. Yeah, because it was in the modern period when there was this perhaps, people starting to question the role of religion, yeah, in our lives, etc. And in response to that, yeah, um, uh, the Muslims felt the need, yeah, to come up with a response to these challenges. So central to the modernist approach is the idea of reform. Yeah. So here, reform is important. Yeah. Or reform becomes the main or the significant feature of this period, or sorry, of this genre of tafsir. So the modern context demanded a reappraisal of the intellectual heritage of Muslims, yeah, because it was observed that Muslims began to blindly imitate, yeah, what was passed on or inherited from the past, yeah. So there was this call basically to give up this practice of blind imitation or taqlid. and the need for flexible interpretation of Islam and its sources in order to develop ideas, yeah, which are compatible with modern conditions, because conditions have changed, different challenges are being faced, yeah, by society or by humanity. So this requires a flexible interpretation of Islam and its sources, and the need to understand the Quran from a scientific worldview. Yeah. And also, the modernist exegesis advocate a return to Islam as it was originally practiced, and condemned deviations and additions not considered worthy of the early generations of Muslims. Yeah, and they accept that the concept of revelation, yeah, did not clash with the use of reason. So here, the integration between revelation and also reason became important, yeah, in this sense, and it also revived Islam's rationalist and also a rationalist philosophical tradition. So here the role of reason, yeah, is being highlighted, yeah. um, but that does not mean that, revelation is being sidelined. But perhaps here is the integration between both, and the appreciation that both have a role to play in the modern period. As for scientific exegesis, yeah, early forms of scientific exegesis in the 20th century attempted to reconcile Quranic teachings with scientific knowledge, yeah. Um, and today, scientific exegesis has basically come to be related to the idea that the Quran predicted many of the findings of modern science, yeah. Um, so here, I mean, in the modern period, there was this attempt basically to reconcile Quranic teachings to scientific knowledge, and also perhaps to harmonize, yeah, the Quran with scientific discoveries or findings of modern science, yeah, and claiming that perhaps, yeah, certain Quranic verses actually predicted, yeah, many of the findings of modern science. However, this genre, or this category of tafsir was criticized, yeah, for ignoring the open-ended nature of scientific discovery and misreading the Quran. Yeah, so there is this issue. I think perhaps we have actually discussed this when we looked at the ijaz of the Quran. Yeah, particularly scientific ijaz. Yeah. Uh, in which it ignores the open-ended nature of scientific discovery, and often, yeah, misread or perhaps ignore the context of the Quranic verse, yeah, in its attempt to validate certain scientific findings, yeah. And it is perhaps one of the most popular forms of Quranic exegesis in the modern period. And we can see, for example, yeah, Bukhail and his interpretation of certain Quranic verses, which he claims to be, or which he claims to provide, yeah, predictions of many findings of modern science. We also have socio-political exegesis in the modern period, which was mainly developed by Sayyid Qutb, yeah, and his famous tafsir Fil Zilal al-Quran, yeah, which was a major source of inspiration for those who seek a closer connection between Islam and the state. Yeah, so here we are looking at the role of Islam in governance, or in what do you call it, in government, yeah, in managing the affairs of a country, etc. So he suggested that many aspects of modern society, yeah, including many modern Muslims themselves, were jahili, yeah, were basically, jahiliya in reference to the jahiliya, yeah, and he also described jahiliya in the 21st century, criticizing, yeah, certain aspects of modern society as binary resemblance with that of the jahiliya, yeah. And he argued that Islam should be the guiding and dominant political force of nations with majority Muslim populations. Perhaps we will look into this in much more detail later, inshallah. Thematic exegesis basically emphasizes the unity of the Quran, yeah, which approaches the interpretation as a study of the Quran as a whole rather than uh, in segments, yeah, rather than in unitary form, meaning that each unit of verses, yeah, were treated separately. However, when it comes to the thematic exegesis, they will consider the Quran as a whole, yeah, and this is arguably, yeah, arguably allows for a more objective approach to the Quran. So this is thematic exegesis, and we have, for example, Fazl Rahman, yeah, uh, uh, and his famous book Major Themes in the Quran, which looked or which perhaps is an example of this approach of tafsir, thematic exegesis. In the modern period, also we have feminist exegesis, yeah, because most feminist exegesis criticize traditional male-centered interpretations of the Quran, because they argued, yeah, in the past, most of the fuqaha, most of the mufassir were basically male, yeah, and because of this, tafsir was gender biased, yeah. Uh, so uh, so they argued that there were gender biases of predominantly male exegetes, yeah, which have largely shaped understandings of the Quran, yeah. So this is the argument put forward by the feminist. um, and they refer actually to the Quran and also the Prophet's Sunnah to support their claim that the Quran needs to be reinterpreted, yeah, and they suggest that the teachings of the Quran do not support patriarchy, but rather are highly egalitarian, yeah, meaning that, this idea that men are above women, etc., is not supported in the Quran, and the Quran calls for equality, yeah, and it is necessary here, according to them, to avoid, yeah, masculinizing God, yeah, or to perhaps, relate masculine attributes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As for contextualist exegesis, yeah, they argued, or the Quranic exegetes, yeah, which fall under this genre or category of tafsir, they argued that the teachings of the Quran should be applied in different ways depending on the context. Yeah, so here there is this emphasis, yeah, on the context of revelation. Yeah, where scholars must be aware of both the social, political, and cultural context of the revelation, as well as the setting in which interpretation occurs today. Yeah, so appreciating the context in which the verses of the Quran were revealed, and appreciating a modern or current context, yeah, in applying the teachings of the Quran. So this is an important aspect, yeah, appreciating the context, and we cannot divorce, yeah, Quranic exegesis from the context in which the revelation was revealed, or in which the Quranic verses or passages were revealed. Uh, in this sense, ijtihad or independent thinking and reasoning should play a key role in contemporary Muslim life, and as such, there is a need of exploring new ways of looking at the text. Yeah, and this allows for a greater scope to interpret the Quran and question the rulings of earlier scholars. Yeah, and to basically revisit, reassess, yeah, the opinions of earlier scholars when it comes to the exegesis of Quranic passages or verses. And also, it is important to relate the Quran to contemporary concerns and needs by reference to various Quranic ideas and principles that are relevant to the modern period. So, for an example, yeah, uh, human rights, yeah, democracy, etc., yeah, taking this into consideration and contextualizing the Quranic passages in relation to governance, etc., yeah, one can then perhaps infer certain principles and guidance from the Quran in relation to these concepts, or to this what you call it, ideas which are prevalent in modern societies. So basically, this was the main reference which I relied on in preparing the materials for this slide. Yeah. Uh, Let me just stop sharing. So I hope that you will, inshallah, at least go through the slides before our meeting on Wednesday morning, inshallah. Yeah, where if you have any questions or any issues which with in relation to what I have presented, please don't hesitate, yeah, to ask or raise such questions or issues in our meeting on Wednesday morning, بإذن الله تعالى. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Please take care of yourselves, stay safe, and also stay safe. Thank you.